So I just volunteered to do anything and everything that I could make time for. So I helped out with some learning and development. I helped out with our HRBPs. I helped out with performance reviews. I literally would do anything that they would let me to just get as much experience as I could. And to just also, I wanted to figure out what I wanted to do, because I realized pretty early on that I didn't want to do recruiting long-term. It was interesting and helpful, but I was much more interested in some of the other functions within HR. So I just took a lot of initiative and raised my hand to do as much as possible, which paid off.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by Upskill HR and ACE the HR exam. These are personal development and recertification and HR certification tools. You can learn more about Upskill HR at upskillhr.com and ACE the HR exam at acethehrexam.com. This podcast is a part of a series on the Workology Podcast that is focused on the roles and responsibilities of the CHRO, also known as the Chief Human Resources Officer. The CHRO is also sometimes called the VP of People or the Chief People Officer. This is an executive or C-level role that deals with managing human resources as well as with organizational development and implementing policies of change to improve the overall efficiency of the company. The CHRO podcast series here on Workology is powered by HR Benchmark Survey. Visit www.hrbenchmarksurvey.com. One of the reasons we continue to do this series, really since 2020, is because there is a lot of mystery around that chief HR officer level role. Our jobs have dramatically and drastically changed over the last 3 years, and they continue to change at a rapid pace. So I want aspiring CHROs to know the types of skills and experiences they need to promote into a future role as a Chief Human Resources Officer. It's also important to hear from our peers, our senior HR executive peers, and how they're doing things like partnering and collaborating with executives and supporting the business. Before we move forward, I want to hear from you. Text the word podcast to 512-548-3005. Ask me questions, leave comments, and make suggestions for future guests. This is my community text number, and I want to hear from you. Now, throughout this CHRO podcast series, we've asked each and every single guest. I think we've had over 50 CHRO interviews since I started this, but we've asked each and every one of them about how they began their careers and grew into those CHRO roles. And their answers remain really varied and interesting. So in this podcast series episode, we're going to share some excerpts from some of the best interviews on the Workology podcast with those CHROs. Also, we're going to throw in some VPs of HR, maybe some chief people officers, and I want you to learn how some of the most successful professionals in the industry started their careers with an eye on that leadership role. So in episode order, here is who we're going to hear from. Lisa Novak, the Vice President of Employee Experience at Data.World. Matt Brown, Chief People Officer and Culture Officer at Skooks, Amy Capilani-Wolf, CHRO at Cohensity, and Leslie Ament, Head of People at Kojo Technologies. Our first interview comes from Lisa Novak. She's the Vice President of Employee Experience for Data.World. Lisa has over 20 years of experience in staffing and human resources leadership, primarily in the tech industry for companies as they ramp up for significant growth or organizational change. In her current role at Data.World, Lisa is responsible for driving the organizational strategy for acquiring, developing, and retaining a diverse team of Austin, Texas best talent in this highly competitive talent market here in the ATX. Prior to joining Data.World, she served on executive teams for a number of organizations and also led HR organizations for companies like Renew Data, Sigmatel, and Brooktree through extensive and rapid growth, and she's helped create a positive and motivated culture in the organizations she has served. Let's listen in. I'm so excited to talk with you. I was talking to someone a couple weeks ago. I was like, I have this podcast coming up and I can't wait for it. So let's get into it and start first with some background and maybe tell us how you got your start in HR and how your role has evolved over time into your current one, which is the VP of Employee Experience.
Absolutely. Well, I started in the recruiting world, as can often be the case, and really my career evolved from there into the full desk HR and ultimately HR leadership over time. Because what I found was in recruiting, and started at a recruiting firm, so I was outside of the corporate environment, I missed the next step. What was happening next with that candidate who I just helped change their life? And so I went in-house as a recruiter in-house and got to really help build out that entire kind of story for our candidate and the full candidate experience. And then found myself wondering what next, and wanted to really expand on that. What was next for that new employee? How did they get onboarded? How did they learn and grow within the organization? How did the organization keep them motivated? And over time grew across all of HR with that curiosity and that passion for the full employee story.
I love that. So I tend to do podcasts like so many a day. And so the other person that I interviewed today, he also started in recruiting and is now in HR. So I think it's a common path is to come from the recruiting staffing world and then eventually move into human resources.
It's not uncommon. I warn my recruiters that sometimes too, that I'm going to pull them into HR, there's a real likelihood if their curiosity and their drive is strong enough in the rest of the areas, that I'm going to pull them into the rest of the areas because I think there's a real kind of foundational drive to help the people to understand the people, and the more we can build on that, the stronger our HR team, or in our case, employee experience team, is going to be.
Our next excerpt comes from Matt Brown. He's the Chief People and Culture Officer with Skooks. Matt has 15 plus years of experience in IT, HR, L&D, and talent management across multiple industries, primarily in the hospitality and restaurant spaces. Today, he blends people, processes, and technology to better connect HR with learning and development, helping organize and create cultures and experiences that have a lasting impact. You're going to love listening and hearing this from Matt. I am a fun gal that likes to put people in the center of it. So I know this is going to be a fun conversation. I mentioned the intro a little bit about how you got here, but let's kind of back up. Tell us, how did you get started, especially in HR, and how has your work evolved over time into your current role?
I think I always love sharing my story. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible because I'm a talker. I can go on for hours and hours, but I think, I took a very, I would call it non-traditional path, especially given the time that I was coming through the ranks in the 90s, the early 2000s. I should put it out there first that I started my professional career without a college degree, right? Like that, who am I? What are you doing in the world? Why is this the case? I like to do things a little more difficult, right? Like the challenge. I, in 2016, went back and got my degree in HR management, which it did add some value, but I want to put that out there to begin the story, just because I want people to know the only obstacles, the only barriers that you have are really the ones that you put on yourself, right? Just persistence and patience and looking for creative ways to leverage what you bring. I got my first exposure to HR, honestly, I went to a training class years and years and years ago. I worked for Chase Mortgage, now JP Morgan Chase Investment Services. And I was just an eager participant in a training class. And I was so enamored by what the facilitator was doing. And I was there to learn a lot about the content, but I found myself really focusing on that art of training. So I created a relationship with that person and spent time really just digging in to understand, like, how did you get here? What drove you here? Why this? Because I come from a family of educators. I've got a lot of teachers, and between my siblings, parents, grandparents. And so I understand the mindset there, but I was curious about it from that perspective. And so then I was able to kind of find a way to step into training, and I had a wide range of roles. I'm very technically minded. So my crossover point was easy to go in as a learning technologist. And then I went from learning technologist to instructional designer, facilitator. And then it felt like there was something missing. Like training is only part of the equation. And when I got to a place where I saw training and HR start to come together, that's when I knew really where I wanted to go and that I needed to go a little bit further in to satisfy what my curiosities were. Along the way, I tried some project management roles. I actually, again, being a technology guy, took some IT leadership roles, and fun way to partner with HR from an IT perspective. And then when I joined Scoops 4.5 years ago, I was given the opportunity to leverage my experience as an HR practitioner and a people development specialist in some creative ways. We're a tech company. We are a learning and talent development platform provider. So our CEO said, hey, I think you'd be really great to start building the foundation for marketing. You are our customer. You know, you've lived that life. You know what they are concerned about. You know what drives them, what motivates them. So like help us in that way, which I never thought that would be a possibility, but here we go. Let's go do it. And then that ultimately led me to this role, Chief People and Culture Officer, which has been my proudest moment ever.
Let's take a little reset. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by Upskill HR and Ace the HR Exam. We're sharing some of the best responses from podcast guests from our CHROs on how they got started in their HR careers. The CHRO podcast series, which is what you're listening to now on Workology, is powered by the HR Benchmark Survey. Visit www.hrbenchmarksurvey.com. Before we get back to our next guest, I want to hear from you. Text the word podcast to 512-548-3005. Ask questions, leave comments, and make suggestions for future podcast guests. This is my community text number, and I want to hear from you.
Benchmarking and data is crucial to HR leaders. Workology's HR Benchmark Survey is an always-on survey, and just by taking the survey at hrbenchmarksurvey.com, you're signing up to get comprehensive quarterly results, white papers, and other research from the survey right to your inbox. It takes 10 minutes or less to complete. Visit hrbenchmarksurvey.com.
So let's move on to our next interview. This is with Amy Capelanti-Wolf, the CHRO of Cohesity. In this role, she is responsible for spearheading workforce strategies, including global talent acquisition and development, employee experience, total rewards and well-being, and the real estate workplace environment. Very interesting. Before joining the company in 2021, she served as the Senior Vice President, CHRO, Corporate Real Estate, and Global Diversity and Inclusion Lead at a security company, Cimatech Corp. Prior to that, she was the CHRO at Silver Springs Networks, Inc., and held HR leadership roles at companies like Cisco Systems, Inc., Sun Microsystems, the Walt Disney Company, and PepsiCo. Amy serves on the boards of SoftChoice, a North American provider of technology solutions and managed services, as well as BetterWorks, a continuous performance management platform company, and Pivotal, a company that focuses on foster youth education and employment. She is a member of the BetterWorks HR Advisory Council, the Hitch Advisory Council, and she was the 2018 recipient of the National Diversity Council's Top 50 Most Powerful Women in Technology Award. I love hearing your accolades and all the work that you've done, and then the work that you're continuing to do. I think it's important to really understand, and for others to understand the impact that you have been making in not just HR, but for future generations and leaders in the workplace. So let's start with some background. How did you get your start in HR? And tell me about maybe how your work has evolved over time into that current CHRO role.
That's a great question. And, I'm not one of those people that had life figured out at age 6. I always really respect people who say, I'm going to be a doctor at age 6 and they become a doctor. I, however, was interested in lots of things. I loved chemistry. I loved literature, writing, sports. So I was sort of a jack of all trades, expert at nothing, but, relatively okay in other things. And so I went to school majoring in pre-pharmacy, thinking I would go into pharmaceuticals. And about a year into the studies, doing really well, I realized I was not passionate about what I had engaged to study with. So I looked around and thought, you know, what I really like is journalism. I love to read. I love to write. I'm very grounded in what's happening in the world, even then, many years back. So I thought, let's try that for a go. And I flourished in that. I loved working in journalism. I did everything from public relations to advertising to copy editing. So, of course, as a mother of two daughters who are college and junior or high school, I do a lot of review of their essays, so to speak. But nonetheless, I majored in journalism, and then the summer I graduated, or the fall, the spring I graduated, the markets were just awful. And so I thought, well, I'm going to wait and maybe go to grad school before I embark into working in the corporate world, having worked in bartending and servicing throughout most of my college career. So I looked around and I found this Master's of Industrial and Labor Relations, which was under the business school, which I liked because it gave you business classes, but also gave you a specialty in organizational design, psychology, incentives and rewards, et cetera, et cetera. So I enrolled in this sort of blindly. It was an 18-month program. I went past it pretty quickly and I loved it. I realized, wow, this is really interesting about human resources around the full gambit of what the function does, and more importantly, the effect it can have positively both on the employee experience as well for the company. So it seemed a really natural fit for me. And we had a very strong program. I went to West Virginia University. It's a strong labor relations program because of the unions that we had at the time. So Frito-Lay and PepsiCo and other companies of that ilk came on campus. And so I was recruited by Frito-Lay and spent my first 7 years as an HR professional working in salty snacks and consumer products, which was a great entrance into learning about human resources.
Our final interview excerpt is with Leslie Ahmed, head of people with Kojo Technologies. Leslie holds a SHRM SCP and has been working in HR since her first job out of college as a recruiting coordinator. She has been an HR generalist, HR representative, HR manager, staffing specialist, and an HR business partner. And her career and her roles in HR have grown. They have grown across a variety of industries, including healthcare, financial services, retail, manufacturing, and of course, technology.
Let's start with your background. You have truly worked your way up the ladder in HR, which I absolutely love. I wanted to ask what led you to choose HR and how has your career evolved over time into your current role, which is the head of people?
Yeah, I actually fell into HR. I wasn't necessarily intentionally pursuing a career in HR. At the time that I graduated from college, I lived in my smaller college town and there weren't a ton of job opportunities, but I had a network connection who got me a job as a recruiting coordinator for a small third-party agency recruiting group. And that's sort of how I first got my taste into recruiting. And I remember enjoying it, but thinking, I think I would rather work for one company and recruit for them versus trying to recruit for a lot of companies and then also trying to market candidates. And so my next job, I moved over onto the corporate HR recruiting side and then grew from there.
I love that. I love that so much. And it's funny because on TikTok, we get a lot of questions, DMs and different things of people who are like, I want to start in HR, or I'm a recruiting coordinator, an HR coordinator. How do I get promoted? So tell us more about kind of how you grew.
Yes, I was pretty fortunate that second job was also as a recruiting coordinator, but it was with a fast growing company. So at the time, we were just trying to keep up. The whole HR department, recruiting and all the other functions alike, everyone was slightly under-resourced. So there were lots of opportunities for me to just raise my hand and be like, I'll do it. So I just volunteered to do anything and everything that I could make time for. So I helped out with some learning and development. I helped out with our HRBPs. I helped out with performance reviews. I literally would do anything that they would let me to just get as much experience as I could. And to just also, I wanted to figure out what I wanted to do because I realized pretty early on that I didn't want to do recruiting long-term. It was interesting and helpful, but I was much more interested in some of the other functions within HR. So I just took a lot of initiative and raised my hand to do as much as possible, which paid off. I had the opportunity to then move into a staffing coordinator and full lifecycle recruiter. And then when there was an opportunity to move over into an HR representative position at the time, which I would say is most analogous to like a junior level HRBP today, I got that opportunity.
I love this series so much, and that's why we continue to do it, because everybody's experience in HR is completely different. It is no journey is the same for any CHRO. Certainly my career is crazy, and I never thought that I would be here. It's so interesting to delve into a role like the CHRO, whose experience more closely connects than to strategy and operations of the overall business, and really how we work with the rest of the company leadership team to make all that happen. I love hearing stories about how these HR leaders got their start in human resources and what led them to that CHRO role. There are so many different ways to grow your HR career. I'm inspired by these stories, and I hope that you are too. This podcast series is powered by HR development courses, Ace the HR Exam, and Upskill HR. You can visit www.acethehrexam.com or upskillhr.com to learn more. Before we close on this episode, I want to hear from you. Text the word podcast to 512-548-3005. Ask me questions, leave comments, make suggestions for future guests, future topics. Just let me know what you want to hear about. This is my community text number. I also want to thank you for joining the Workology Podcast. It makes no sense to keep doing this podcast if you weren't telling me what you wanted to hear, you weren't listening in and connecting with our guests and me. This podcast is sponsored by HR Benchmark Survey. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. Let's change HR together. My name is Jessica Miller Merrill. Until next time, visit workology.com to listen to all our Workology podcast episodes.